Thank you very much. Welcome, everyone. It's a delight to be here. I would love knowing where people are from, so using the chat function and being able to read that as I'm presenting would be great. I'm going to start just a little bit about who I am and what brings me to this work. And Lally talked about the desired outcomes, which I'll reference just briefly, and then dive into the content. So I run a business, a company called Conditioning Leaders, and our mission is to condition leaders and organizations to do meaningful work for decades. And so what does that mean? In a practical level, I'm a leadership professional, and I support people to address their most vexing leadership challenges, of which diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace is a huge one. I do have a background in the performing arts, so I'm also trained in leadership embodiment and bring a somatic and an embodied approach to leadership and how we think about sustaining ourselves as leaders, as social activists, as educators, as people that care about creating a more just society. Lally mentioned that I'm one of the co-founders of the Trinity Church anti-racism team, where we're doing, decades-long culture change work. It is a church that, is founded and has connections to slave history. So how we grapple with that in the present reality is a part of our faith work. I also teach at Harvard Extension School. I teach a 2-day coaching course called Leadership Coaching Strategies, and in their management graduate track, a course called Nonprofit Leadership and Community Engagement. And I mention that just because working in a global context, last 2 weeks ago, I was teaching my coaching course and I had people from all 7 continents. So how we create environments of learning, environments where we can be completely inclusive is of particular interest to me. I studied a body of work called Conversational Intelligence, which is all about bringing neuroscience into the leadership space, into the field of inclusion and diversity and equity work, and how we do culture change in our institutions and in our organizations and networks is something I'm particularly fascinated by, what it means to create trust in workplaces. So that's a little bit about me. Let's continue on our journey. So I'm going to advance the slides. Lally mentioned that we're going to, do some definitions, understand how bias shows up in our relationships, in our workplaces, how it reinforces and supports inequity and, looking at the lens of racism. We'll also take some time to explore what are some basic techniques to address bias. And then I have some resources to offer. There's tons of information out there. So just wanted to give you a few resources. Let's start with some sort of fun questions. And I think, Mary Liz, you're going to be able to manage the chat function. So there's a question here, which is, of 14.5% of men in America that can claim to have this attribute, nearly 60% of men of Fortune 500 companies, CEOs do. So you have 3 choices, and go ahead and click. Is it an IQ of over 150? Is it that 14.5% of men in America claim to stand at a height of 6 feet or above if they're, Fortune 500 CEO? Or is it the college degree? I'll give you a moment to answer or think about which is your answer. Are the answers coming in, Mary Liz?
They are indeed. I'll give it 10 or 12 more seconds to let people answer in the poll. All right. I am closing the poll if you would like to participate. Okay. All right. All right, Madeline, would you like me to share the number for
Yeah,
each of these that I have?
sure.
So 3 people have answered an IQ of over 150. 10 people have answered a standing height of over 6 foot. And 4 people have answered a college degree.
All right. Excellent. Nice. And the answer is the B, or the middle one, a standing height of over 6 feet. So it's kind of fun to see the statistic. There's correlation, as it says, there's a study that correlates the number of inches above 6 feet that you are and how much that relates to your income. This is from Great Britain, but I've heard of statistics of $789 per year for every inch. Anyway, let's look at another one. Advancing the slide, whoops. Okay, so offering a job to the candidate you most clicked with. Yeah, go ahead and put the question. You shared an interest with this person, or they studied at the same university. Isn't unconscious bias, particularly if they're a different gender, ethnicity, or sexuality. So is this true or false? Giving a job to the candidate you most, quote, clicked with. Whoops. All right.
Okay. And I'm going to wrap up this poll right about now. Okay. So 88% of folks say false, and 12% of folks say true.
All right. So it is false. There's something called affinity bias. It's the factor at play when a juicy role goes to the graduate of a same college or with whom you have a shared interest. Hiring in one's own image is the idea here. There's lots of different kinds of bias. We'll talk about a few, but affinity bias is common in our lives. I certainly fall prey to affinity bias all the time. I grew up in Boston. I'm from Boston. I want to know what street you lived on, what neighborhood you lived on, as if somehow that's going to mean something more significant if somebody is, you know, from my neighborhood or my town versus another place. I think I have one more question, or let's see, I might have skipped it. Yes, I did. We're just going to continue. So what is unconscious bias? This idea, there's lots of ways to describe it. Implicit bias, implicit social cognition. But it's the idea that our attitudes and stereotypes affect the way we understand the actions we take and the decisions that we make, and we're not even conscious of it. It just happens instinctually, unconsciously. And bias is not something we can rid ourselves of. We all have biases. There's no such thing as a bias-free workplace, home, environment. We make assessments that are both favorable and unfavorable. So some of our biases are good. We want to recognize that bias isn't all negative. We are talking about bias and how it affects, you know, injustice and particularly issues social oppression. So we're looking at the shadow side of it, or emphasizing the shadow side of it today. But bias in and of itself is not negative or positive. It's just a way that we humans are hardwired. I'll talk a little bit more about neuroscience, and I have some information to share around that later in the presentation. This idea of bias is activated involuntarily. It's without our awareness, without our control. It's deep within our beings, in the subconscious, in the unconscious. It's also different from biases that we know about that we conceal. So one of the exercises I give my clients, whether it's a leadership coaching client or I'm teaching a 6-part webinar right now about a brain and body approach to undoing oppression for facilitators. And we're going to give them the assignment to track their thought microaggressions, the way that their thoughts show up and start to become aware of them. So we often hide things that are socially unacceptable, this idea of sort of it not being politically correct. So we're really talking about, those are things that are at our conscious level, but what's going on at the unconscious level. And introspection, our own sort of solo reflection, doesn't enable us to really see biases. We need to be in relationship. We need to hit up against them, be out in the world for the unconscious biases to come to the surface. And feel free, Mary Liz, if there are questions that you want me to answer as I go. So I mentioned there are lots of different types of biases. Here's just 4 that are common. Affinity bias, that was in one of the questions. Halo bias, this idea that if you like something about somebody, that all things about them must be great. Confirmation bias, so you have a belief, you have an opinion, and you look for evidence to support that belief or opinion. Conformity bias, that shows up a lot. We are in a conversation, in a meeting, we're trying to make a decision about something. The bulk of the people in the meeting, agree a certain way, and we kind of go with the flow. Not always bad, but sometimes problematic if we're not really assessing our intentions and our impact. And there are many more, so you can go ahead and Google. I think a colleague of mine said there are over 150 different types of bias. I want to take a moment. This is a 1-minute video that I thought would be really powerful to share with you all. So let's see if we can get it going.
My name is Jose Zamora, and I had to drop a letter to get the title. Every morning I wake up, go on Craigslist, and apply to
Madeline, I think you have to switch tabs in your screen for us to see this.
About 50 to 100.
Because we can hear it, but we can't see it.
Can you see it now?
No.
No. Okay, hold on. Sorry. Oh dear. Let's X out. All right, you got it now?
Yes.
Let's start over.
My name is Jose Zamora, and I had to drop a letter to get the title. Every morning I wake up, go on Craigslist, and apply to as many jobs, every job that I feel qualified for. About 50 to 100 a day for months. No phone calls, no emails. One day I just thought, what if I tried to remove the S in my name and maybe I can make some policy? The Monday I decided to go from Jose to Joe. 7 days later, the next Monday, that's when all the responses started coming. That's when all the replies and emails. The position is open, that we want to meet with you. Call us back. I was applying for the same exact job, the exact same resume, the exact same experience, just to fit me. Sometimes I don't even think people know or conscious or aware that they're judging, even if it's by name, but I think we all do it all the time.
All right. So, incredibly powerful. Something as simple as a letter in one's name can change the trajectory of a person's life. We know this. This is not new for most of us, but incredibly poignant if we slow ourselves down enough to notice how we might be affecting the trajectory of people's lives. just because of.
Can you check the aspect ratio on your PowerPoint display, because we're getting it cropped on either side?
Well, let's see how it, it's cropped.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So here's an interesting study, and again, you can look it up, but in the healthcare field, so pediatricians were treating people for pain, and they found that they were prescribing painkillers more commonly, more frequently to people who were white as opposed to people who were black. In the healthcare field, we know that there are disproportionate outcomes for people of color and for white folks, depending on all different kinds of illnesses and disease and just societally. So this is an example of bias. We're not conscious of it. We just think as doctors, we're giving out painkillers as needed, as requested. And yet when the research was done by the Kirwan Institute, a great resource, by the way, it was, shown that here's some bias around race and privileging white people over people of color in terms of their ability to manage and endure pain and medication. There's another test or another example. Criminal sentencing. I think this is a fascinating one. So Afrocentric featured bias. People who had darker skin, wider nose, fuller lips, we would say those are possess more Afrocentric features, were found to receive longer sentences than those people who were less Afrocentrically featured. And this phenomenon showed itself over both black and white male inmates. So even a white male who had wider noses, darker skin, and fuller lips were given longer sentences. We can go on and on to look at disturbing ways that bias affects individuals, affects communities, affects society. And it's our job, particularly given those of us that care about education and young people and who we are as Christians and as people of God, to slow down and to start really taking time to unpack the ways that this stuff is the air that we breathe and just so much in our beings. Another interesting statistic from the Casey Foundation, when they were looking at people applying for grants, organizations, they lifted up gender bias, and they found that in the critiquing of grants at the Casey Foundation, women were critiqued more, and Black recipients were given less money than white recipients. So, even well-intentioned social justice, those of us that are on the front lines leading this work, we are prey to how bias affects us in our own lives. One of the most humbling and awakening experiences in my life is as a teacher grading papers. So I teach a course at Harvard Extension School, Nonprofit Leadership and Community Engagement. I have my students work on projects that are around issues of power, equity, and inclusion. And I have a TA, African-American man that was in the program, a graduate in my class, and now works with me. And he's a writer, he's a poet, a published author. And I'm so grateful for grading papers as a way for me to see my biases. How I assess people's grammar. All kinds of things show up when we have to make assessments. So if you're somebody in your work life where you're constantly making decisions and making assessments, drawing inferences, noticing, what bias is at play here? And how might I bring my awareness and my consciousness to a higher level so that I'm not perpetuating. So for me, grading papers is a profound place where I have to slow down, really stop and notice where my bias is starting to act out, and then take some precautions and work with others. One of the tools for mitigating bias is working in collaboration. One other short video I want to share with you all, hopefully this will work, sorry for the glitches, is about how the psychology of white supremacy is embedded at such a young age. We know this is a 2020 ABC News video. So let me see if I can get it right. Mary Liz, thank you for popping in and helping.
We brought together
so hold on.
Kids at this day camp.
I need to new share.
We can see that if you just make it full screen. Well, yeah, that's great.
Is that better?
Yes.
We brought together 3 groups of kids at this day camp and showed them pictures of 2 men, one Arab, the other Asian.
Who do you like better, this man or this man?
The Chinese guy.
Over and over, they said they liked the Asian man more than the Arab.
He looks meaner and he looks nicer. Because he looks nicer? Yeah, he does look nicer. And he has a smile.
But both men are smiling. And what do the kids think about the personalities of the men?
Let me ask, you don't know this person, but what do you think he's like?
I think he's weird.
Why is he weird?
He just doesn't look like a very nice person. No. He looks like a scary dude.
He's on the phone. What's he talking about?
Maybe a raspberry?
Then I asked about the Asian man.
What's he like?
He looks like a regular teenager to me.
We then showed them pictures of a black man and a white man. What were some comments about the black man?
He looks mean. FBI most wanted. He looks mean. He looks like this basketball player.
So, tell me about this guy. He seems like a nice person.
I think he's nice. I think he's nice, except he might be mad about something.
He was probably picking up on something. This is Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh. But when we asked which man is a criminal, most kids pointed to the black man. And when we asked which was a teacher, they said,
that one! The guy in the green shirt.
we brought together.
Oops. Comments or
We're cropped again.
questions? Let's see. How's that?
Looks good.
All right. Any comments in the chat box or any thoughts
Not yet.
about these videos? Just some dynamics to notice about that video. There was, at least I saw one young boy, African-American or black boy in the video, who just sort of wasn't really present in the interactions. I just noted that. There might have been another student of color, but how much, even in the making of a video about bias, how that shows up in the process. These are all things to develop our awareness and eyes towards. So what can we do about unconscious bias? What can I do? What can we do? Some thoughts, and this is where we can work together. So I'm trained in a body of work called conversational intelligence, and this ladder of conclusions is a model that I find really helpful. Maybe people know the ladder of inference. It's a little more popular, but we are hardwired as human beings to make meaning. One of the distinguishing traits of our species is that we can reflect, we can make meaning, we can understand what's happening in the world around us from a biological level, and this is where some of the neuroscience comes in. in 0.07 seconds, we make unconscious judgments. Is this a safe environment? Is this somebody that I think I can connect with? Can I not? It's instinctual, it's energetic. And then it comes to the feeling level where we start to notice our feelings. Am I comfortable here? Am I safe here? Am I not safe here? Wherever, you walk into a new job, you attend a workshop, you go to visit somebody's house. So these are all things that are happening all the time. You go into the grocery store. So our feelings generate thoughts. Words create worlds. We start to have thoughts. We start to have interpretations of what's happening around us. Interpretations are based on our past, based on beliefs and awarenesses that we currently have, and we draw conclusions. Easily, we start to have beliefs and conclusions that are fixed. And ultimately, we take action based on our conclusions and our beliefs. And those actions can produce positive outcomes or negative outcomes. So this mental model of the ladder of conclusions, the ladder of inference, and there's a video here, Rethinking Thinking, which I'm not going to show you, but is also a helpful way to unpack, geez, how does our mental model work? We go up our ladders, so to speak, go from the bottom rung to bioreactions up to conclusions, beliefs in a nanosecond. It takes no time at all. We spend an enormous amount of time drawing inferences and making meaning. We can't not do that as human beings. So it's one of the most powerful tools, and I share this in my coaching practice. I share this when folks are interested in this topic of unconscious bias, is how can I slow myself down enough? Take a deep breath right now. To notice what's happening to me physically. To notice, am I getting tense? Am I getting anxious? Does something feel off here? And then to begin to decide, what am I going to do with that awareness, that consciousness? So slowing people's thought processes down, slowing our own, so that we can actually, in our world of teaching this, go back down the rungs of the ladder to be more present to what's really happening. In the work, we say that conflict resides in our stories about things, not always in what's actually happening. I mean, absolutely, when we're talking about bias in those videos, there's all kinds of microaggressions that were happening in that video, comparing the children's comparing the images of the men, or there's a video that I'm not going to share with you, but it's in the resource page about what happens to a young person who is in a school setting and they're disproportionately, told to be quiet or to sit still, or all the ways that we think young people are supposed to be in our educational systems, and how it's actually not designed to support everybody. So that's one tool that I want to introduce you all to as an incredibly powerful way to counter our unconscious biases and work. A little bit about neuroscience, just this is sort of high level stuff, but again, when people ask, what can I do? One of the things that I say is to become more aware of some basic neuroscience principles. So cortisol, adrenaline, and neuroadrenaline are neurochemicals in the body that are necessary for survival and for living, but not necessary to elevate and have on a consistent elevated level, over long periods of time. Cortisol is the most popular one that we talk about when we're doing leadership work and helping people navigate treacherous and sometimes scary conversations about racism and different forms of oppression. As a white woman, I've had to work a lot on being comfortable making mistakes, welcoming making mistakes. I led a webinar last week and I was showing a picture of somebody who I thought was Usain Bolt, the fastest runner in the world. I even had looked and done the Google research, but in fact, it actually was not Usain Bolt. It was, I think, Michael Johnson is his name. Well-intended, but a microaggression nonetheless. My cortisol goes up. I get nervous. I'm embarrassed. I can't think as well. So one of the things that we want to track, and part of why I was trained in an embodied approach to help people work with stress and anxiety in the body is when we have heightened levels of cortisol, when we're in our fight, flight, or freeze brain, we're not able to collaborate. We're not able to partner. We're not able to innovate and think well. So understanding as a leader, as somebody who cares about issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion, what kind of environment are you creating for people to actually increase oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, the neurochemicals that are about connection, pleasure, and calm? Endorphins are phenomenal. We want endorphins in our body. We want dopamine in our bodies, increased oxytocin. So our job as educators and leaders is to create learning environments and workplaces where we're intentionally, consciously creating from a biological level more oxytocin in the people whose lives you are connected to. Questions or comments, if there are any, Mary Liz, at this point?
Not yet.
Okay. Just checking the time. So I'm going to go on a little bit more about some of the things that we can do and the awarenesses that we can bring to the conversation of implicit biases. Understanding that neuroscientists today are really learning so much more about the brain and about how we are socialized as a species. So there's 6 different brains. The primitive brain in the red here is about sensing threats. So we all have this reptilian brain, the fight, flight, or freeze reaction. And the work that I teach, the centering practice that I teach people, particularly when they're stressed and anxious, is to learn to notice that we're making decisions from the primitive brain, that affinity bias, that groupthink bias. Uh-oh, what is my boss going to think of me if I don't agree and go along with the groupthink? That's the primitive brain getting activated. Then there's the heart brain. It's the part of us that can assess, it's that unconscious part very quickly. Am I in sync with these people or not? Is there a sense of friendliness in this environment, or is there a little bit that I need to be nervous about? And when we start to bring people together from different walks of life, from different racial backgrounds, different gender identities, different religions, we are having a sort of heightened experience from the heart brain, if you will. Really, people assessing, do I belong here? Do I not belong here? The limbic brain is where our emotions are stored. We are, as a species, tribal in nature. We are clan-oriented. So there's a part of our brain that is hardwired to want to be with people that look like us, relate to us, feel like they're, from our territory, so to speak. Now, there's nothing wrong. It's how we humans has evolved to be, we are tribal in nature, but that's not all we are. So working with the limbic brain and understanding emotions and how emotions affect decision-making is really important. The neocortex, the part of the brain where cognition happens, we want to bring, awareness about our use of language. When we think about the words we use, in Judith Glazer's work, we say words create worlds. So it's so much when, we often hear the story of somebody who talks about a friend who's Oriental, so an Asian friend, well, my Oriental friend. Well, we know that that adjective and that way of describing somebody who's Asian is offensive. Oriental is an adjective that's used to describe things, not people. So thinking about the neocortex is an important part of understanding the brain and how we want to use our cognitive functioning to support us. Whoops, let me go back. So the youngest brain, the prefrontal cortex, is what neuroscientists and people in the leadership field describe as the executive brain. Coordination, the ability to think about aspirations, the ability to empathize, is closely tied with our mirror neurons, making judgments, trust, integrity. All these things are where in the prefrontal cortex, these soft skills, if you will, reside. So in our work, when I work with people on issues of implicit bias, unconscious bias, equity and inclusion, structural racism, it's so important to focus on cultivating trust and enabling people to, as much as possible, empathize, collaborate, innovate. We want to be in that part of our brain. But it's tricky. I, as a white woman, didn't grow up talking about structural racism. I didn't grow up being encouraged to make mistakes, particularly if I'm talking about a subject that I didn't even grow up talking about, which, again, as a white person, was racism. I saw it all around me. I feel blessed to have been born into a neighborhood and into a street where there were people from all walks of life right outside my door. But for many of us, and I am specifically talking to the people in the audience who are white, this is not a conversation that we're comfortable with. So deepening trust, increasing oxytocin, increasing serotonin helps us navigate conversations that can get tricky, where we can make mistakes, where we can offend people. The gut brain, the part of the brain that is actually connected sort of holistically to how we are from a health perspective, is another important piece because of the role that serotonin plays in our ability to learn and remember. So it's really hard to learn and remember in an environment where we feel threatened. And I have a 10-year-old daughter, and she's in a public school here in Newton, and the race dynamics and the boy-girl dynamics are complicated in her classroom. And she comes home and she tells me stories every day about one of her colleagues, one of her the students in her class, a young boy of color who's treated differently, and she sees it and she doesn't know what to do, and it's a source of frustration and something we talk a lot about. How I teach her about oxytocin, I teach her about serotonin. How can you help your friend Devon have a little more oxytocin, in his body?
We have a couple folks with their hands raised, so I
Great.
see you, Jen and Emmy, that you have your hands raised, and if you have questions you want to ask with your own voice, I can make it so that you can talk and ask your questions. But it would be helpful for me if you could just let me know if that's something you want to do, or if you want to type the question directly to me, please do that in the chat.
So take a deep breath.
Give them a minute.
Take a moment. Lengthen your spine. A little bit more interesting piece about some of the body and the neuroscience is if we exercise our extensor muscles. So if you're on the call right now or you're listening, go ahead and extend your arms out to the side. Open up the palm of your hand. Just a simple act of exercising our extensor muscle can shift. The way we sit and stand can shift the way we think and speak. Now I'm going to ask you to constrict your muscles. Go ahead and cross your arms in front of you. Make fists. Tighten your legs. Tighten your muscles. When we constrict, it's much harder for us to think creatively, to be more inclusive. And yet it's instinctual. When we're stressed and anxious, we constrict. We tighten. Our jaw tightens. Our vision gets more myopic. So another practical thing that I have my clients do is to practice having their palm open in a meeting that they might be nervous to attend, or they have to present. Before this presentation, I was actually opening my palms, opening my chest, being in a more open posture, even though I was nervous.
Okay, so we have Emmy's question, and she is asking for you to please talk more about how the right brain is the change brain versus the left brain, the steady state brain.
Yeah, the neocortex. So thank you for the question. I wish I could say much more. I I don't actually know the details of that research. I certainly can find out more. You know, the right brain sort of and I'd love it if other people on the call know more, is about creativity, is about sort of the thing that we're learning more about the brain is that it's a web, an interconnected web of neurosynapses, and that there's much more of a network connection between the different parts of the brain than what used to be thought in neuroscience. So how we go between more of the sort of steady state versus the change brain is really what's at play as we're thinking about memory and working with creativity, is sort of going back and forth. But I actually thank you for that, and I will make note. I don't know much more about the steady state and the way that we're thinking about each right and left part of the brain. Is there another question?
I haven't heard from Jen. Jen, if you want to type your question, I just don't want to activate your microphone without knowing you are ready to ask. So feel free if you rethink your question or if you have a different question. Oh, here we go. Jen is asking to talk more about microaggressions.
Yes, microaggressions. Anything, and feel free to say more, Jen. What is it that you'd like to know about microaggressions? One of the things so microaggressions are unconscious, maybe sometimes conscious, intentional slights that degrade people that are around us. Often, you know, verbal slights, can be body language. A microaggression is, I as a white person walking down the street and I see I see a man of color walking towards me and I hold my purse tighter. That's a microaggression. The example I gave a few minutes ago on the webinar, there's who, you know, fastest man in the world, black man, Usain Bolt, mistaking him for one of his colleagues, you know, a different runner. Again, it wasn't intentional, but all the stereotypes that go on, you know, when we act out these things that often are unconscious, often are not intentional, but there's a differential impact. And being aware, for me as a white woman, for those of us that lead in white dominated spaces, of the impact of our stereotypes, our comments on people of color, if we're talking about race and racism, is a key piece of what it, you know, means to be an ally, what it means to minimize the impact of our unconscious biases. If you Google, there's a great video about mosquito bites and the metaphor of mosquito bites and microaggressions. There's a short couple-minute video about them. Was there more that you wanted to know or ask about microaggressions?
I think a follow-up question to that from Jen is how to help other folks be aware of their microaggressions. What are some steps you can take?
Yeah, let me pull up the document in just a minute and see if there's some pieces on that. I just wanted to mention a few things and I'll come back to that. So being proximate, Brian Stevenson, if you all know his work, I highly recommend looking into it in his book, Just Mercy. One of the things that he talks about, and one of the things from my life that has enabled me to be effective in these conversations, is being close to those whom I care about. So if I'm a volunteer in a school, and the only time that I get to interact, and I'm a, you know, retired, older white woman, and I'm volunteering in a neighborhood school or connected to my church, is the only time I'm in contact with people of color when I'm volunteering. What might I do differently so that I can be more proximate and more adept at being in a variety of social situations? So I think his work is key to help us confront our own biases. Using the ladder of inference, I like the idea of sort of, we get into these trances when we interpret meaning in a lot of different ways. So using the ladder as a tool to help us over and over again bring the invisible to the visible. Having conversations with colleagues about, could we actually talk about examples of bias in our workplace? And maybe just have a little bit open conversation. So how do you help people? And I'm going to see if I can do the sharing here. Hold on.
So I'm just going to say that it's 2:49, and we do want to leave a few minutes for folks to ask any other questions. So I just want to let everybody know that if you have any questions on what we've heard so far, to please put them in the chat or raise your hand if you're interested in me turning on your microphone so you can ask directly. I know that you want to touch on the debiasing strategies, Madeline, so I'll let you open that up, but I want to let you know that we're going to have some questions coming in that we want to be able to answer.
Great. Are you able to see these?
Yes.
So this is a list of debiasing strategies, sort of thinking from three angles. One is sort of what can we do personally? What can we do in our role in our institutions? And what can our institutions do from a systems approach? There's a lot of stuff out here. I just wanted to offer some sort of practical, tactical ways. It comes up a lot with my clients around hiring and how do I get a more diverse, pool of candidates. From a systems approach, I do know organizations that will not hire somebody until, I think the NFL does this, until they have at least, 2 people, strong candidates of whatever group is on the margins. So even in a case like teaching, where it's predominantly female-oriented, employees and candidates, not hiring somebody until at least 2 male or 2, whatever the dimension of diversity that's on the margins, having a policy in your workplace that says we will not hire until we have at least 2 strong candidates of that group. So that's an example of how can we, from a policy structural standpoint, address a microaggression. Culture change is proportional to the level of trust in an organization, in a group, in a relationship. So when microaggressions happen, and this is partly why a number of years ago I went to Trinity in 2001, so 17 years ago, because I knew I had worked in communities of color for years. I've worked in low-income communities. I'm upper middle class and white. I knew that if I was going to get even better at being an ally and doing racial justice work, I had to work with those people, my people, and it happened to be, upper middle class white. And I had a disdain for organized religion. So I said, I better look at this. And I needed to sit down in a place that felt like home, but also made me want to run. And so I mentioned that story because when people that were around say microaggressions and do things, we can't help it. We want to judge. I, as a white person, wants to be the good white ally. I want to be special, all these tendencies which are very destructive ultimately to deepening trust. So I'm always grateful when a microaggression happens. I have a nephew who, a horrible microaggression happened for him in college just a couple of weeks ago. He texted me at 2 in the morning, just, riddled with shame. And I called him, I love you, just gave him a lot of love. Because when we're working with, when shame is present, it's very hard for us to do anything creative, have compassion, think strategically about how to repair when trust is broken in a relationship. I don't know if that was a good answer, but other questions?
Don't see any here. So it's 2:55, folks, so we're going to start to wrap up. Lally has a couple things to mention before we're done. So if you have any last questions, now is the time to type them into the chat. And Madeline, feel free to give us some last thoughts while I wait and see if anybody has anything else to ask.
Yeah, can you see, I'm scrolling through the slides again. I didn't mean to do this, but.
Yes.
just to wrap up, I want to make sure that there are a few takeaways that you were able to get from this presentation. You know, being able to answer sort of what is the resources, that's what I was looking for. Here's some great resources, videos, and reading. Just want to mention the first resource is a really fun interactive tool. It's a 7-day debiasing cleanse. You can pick, there are 3 tracks, gender track, GBLTQ track, and a racism track, and you get information every day for 7 days. I went ahead and done all 3, but that's a fun interactive experience you can do with colleagues, you could do with family members, you can do in your church. And then there's some other great readings. So just to review, we covered what understanding of what unconscious bias is, what it looks and feels like, how it shows up both in our bodies and in our workplaces, how it harms relationships, how communities, how programs and institutions are affected. At least we touched on that a little bit. Understanding how bias on a micro level can get reinforced structurally across the whole, bodies of people. We certainly see this in the criminal justice system in the United States. We began to explore just a few techniques for addressing bias, the role of neuroscience and understanding the brain and the body in this work. And then I shared with you some resources. So thank you.
Great. Okay. We've got a couple questions that we'll answer, and then Lally will come to a very quick debrief. I'm going to put a link to our webinar evaluation in the chat box right now. So if you have a hard stop at 2 p.m., we would really appreciate it if you would fill out this evaluation. But we've got a couple questions that I want to make sure that we answer. So I'm going to do that. Emily, I see your hand, so I'm going to turn your microphone on and let you talk to Madeline. And then Jen, I see your question as well, and I will make sure that we answer that too. All right, Emmy, go ahead. Oh, I see her. Okay. How can you get the list of resources from Eleanor? Oh, unmute. Okay. Hold on, Eleanor. I will get to that. All right, Emmy, your microphone is on. If you've already asked your question, please repeat it. I am sorry.
Oh, okay. So the resource page was, I couldn't write fast enough. Is there a way for us to have that maybe emailed to us?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And Jen from Chicago asked Madeline, she's talking about your story about your nephew, and she was interested to know if he was on the hurting end. So if he was hurt by a microaggression, or if he had been the one accidentally perpetrating the microaggression.
Yeah, so both. When we are the perpetrators, if we're hopefully awake and have conscience and have serotonin flowing, we're also hurt. So he was deeply hurt, but he was the aggressor. He was the microaggressor. He said a racist slur, he admittedly said in a drunken stupor, but he knew it. He did it, and he was conscious of it. And so how we work with shame, how we work with, shame is the big thing. And then how he
And what were his steps for reparation or apology, or did he have any recourse to try and make it?
He's not taken any action yet. I actually need to talk to him. He's on spring break now. So we haven't sort of worked, it literally happened last week. We haven't worked through it yet in terms of sort of how does he want to repair with, it was at a party. There were lots of people around. It wasn't targeted at an individual. It was sort of something he said out loud. So it was a general like yuckiness that he doesn't know the impact directly, but obviously of course there's one. So he hasn't quite figured out how to handle it, except that we need to do some education and some work around all kinds of things with him.
So Madeline, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. This has been fabulous. And to everybody on the call, this entire webinar will be available on our Facebook pages and also on our website, and that will include all of Madeline's slides. So you don't need to worry about not having been able to type fast enough. I want to invite you all again to please sign up for our newsletter. That's how you will find out about upcoming programs. But I want to highlight two that are already scheduled so you can mark your calendars. On March 27 at 2 o'clock, we will be having a group panel discussion on respecting the separation of church and state in your church-school partnership. We often have people asking a question about this one, and we've got some wonderful experienced experts who are going to have a really interesting conversation about that. And then on April 3rd, we're going to have another direct presentation on the roadmap to a successful church-school partnership. And I'm going to be leading this, and we're going to be drawing on the wisdom of our collective network and what we've learned from you, our partners, over the years. So mark your calendars and invite your friends and family and your congregation members to join us. So in closing, just again, thank you so much for being with us today. We hope you'll spread the word and come back again soon. Bye-bye.
And again, the link to our evaluation is in the chat box. We would love it for all of you to fill that out. It'll take you about 2 minutes.